The black ship had drifted for years in the endless void of space, forgotten by time itself. Its hull, once pristine and gleaming, was now a graveyard of metal and secrets. Lost to history, the ship and its crew had become mere whispers, legends that few dared to believe. But what if those stories were true? What if the black ship was more than just a relic of a long-lost era? What if it held the key to untold power and the secrets of a captain who had vanished without a trace? The stars flickered as a new chapter in this mysterious tale began to unfold. A deep space expedition, known only to a handful of top officials, had recently stumbled upon the wreckage of the black ship. Their mission was simple: recover what they could from the ancient vessel and bring back any valuable technology that might help with the ongoing conflict against the aliens. A ruthless and unpredictable race whose reach had slowly begun to spread across the galaxy. But no one could have predicted what they would find when they boarded the ship. The reports came back in fragments, static-filled transmissions that spoke of something unimaginable lurking within the black ship's bowels. It wasn't the technology that was the real discovery. No, it was something far more chilling, something alive. A being, long thought dead, had been discovered in the captain's quarters. The captain, whose name had faded into obscurity, was said to have vanished mysteriously years ago during a routine mission, leaving the crew to speculate that something darker had been at play. But now, as the ship's crew gathered around the ancient figure, they realized that not only had the captain been alive all this time, he had been waiting for something, or perhaps someone, to find him. The captain, encased in a cryogenic chamber, appeared as though he hadn't aged a day. His eyes, once bright and full of life, were now dull, like the last embers of a fire that refused to die out. Yet, there was something about him, a presence, a weight in the air, that made everyone feel like they were standing on the precipice of something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. What had happened to the crew of the black ship? Where were they now, and why had they vanished so suddenly? The captain's return was only the first piece of the puzzle, and as the crew of the new expedition delved deeper into the wreckage, they uncovered more than just the remains of an ancient vessel. They found signs of a battle fought in the dark recesses of space, with forces beyond their understanding at play. But as they explored further, something began to stir within the ship. Strange whispers echoed through the hallways, voices that shouldn't have been there, reaching out from the ship's dark corners. Was it the ship itself, or was it something the captain had brought back with him? The mysteries surrounding the black ship only deepened as they uncovered a series of encrypted logs, dating back to the time just before the ship's disappearance. The captain's logs were fragmented, but they spoke of something horrifying, an alien force, far beyond anything the galaxy had faced before, something that had been manipulating events from the shadows, controlling even the thoughts of the crew. The aliens were merely a symptom of a far more sinister presence that had already begun to invade the ship. And the captain, it seemed, had known of this threat all along. As the team uncovered more pieces of the ship's hidden history, they realized that their mission had just become something much more dangerous. What they had once thought was a simple recovery operation had evolved into a race against time. The captain wasn't just a survivor of a lost mission, he was the last hope of a galaxy on the brink of total annihilation. But the more they learned, the more they began to question whether the captain was truly a savior, or whether he had become something far darker. With tensions rising, the crew of the expedition found themselves divided. Some believed the captain held the key to ending the threat once and for all, while others began to fear what he had become. What had happened to him during those long years of isolation? What had he learned from the depths of space, and what price had he paid? The further they ventured into the heart of the black ship, the more they began to understand the true nature of the captain's disappearance. He hadn't just vanished, he had been lost to a force far beyond human comprehension. And now, that force was stirring once again, threatening to break free from its prison. The crew knew they were running out of time. With each passing moment, the ship grew more unstable. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though the ship itself was trying to warn them. But was it too late to turn back? The captain was no longer the man they had once believed him to be. He was something more, something ancient and far more dangerous than they had ever anticipated. And then, just as the crew reached the captain's chamber, a final chilling message flashed across their screens. It's too late. You've already lost. The lights flickered and the temperature plummeted. The air grew thick with an eerie silence. They had come for answers, but instead, they had uncovered a nightmare far worse than they could have ever imagined. As the ship's dark secrets began to unravel, one question remained. Could they stop the threat before it consumed them all? Or had they already become part of a much larger game, one that they would never escape? The black ship had returned. And with it, the nightmare had only just begun. The crew stood frozen in the captain's chamber, the last message flashing ominously on their screens. It's too late. You've already lost. The words seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as though the ship itself was alive, aware of their every movement, watching, waiting. The once pristine metal walls now appeared to shift and warp as the temperature dropped further, the air growing thick and dense. The lights flickered again, casting long shadows across the room. The captain's cryogenic chamber, where the body of the lost captain had been discovered, seemed to hum with an eerie low-frequency sound, like the ship was speaking in a language none of them could understand. It was a sound that gnawed at the edges of their minds, causing a creeping sense of unease that none of them could shake. The team was divided, unsure of whether they should trust the man who had been lost to time. Some were eager to hear what he had to say, to learn what knowledge he held after all. The captain had been around when the ship vanished, and if anyone had a grasp on what was truly happening, it was him. But others, including some of the more seasoned officers, began to suspect something far darker was at play. Was the captain even human anymore? If not, what had he become after being trapped in that vessel for so long? One of the engineers, a tall, wiry man with sharp eyes, shifted nervously and glanced toward the captain's chamber. We shouldn't trust him. Whatever happened to him in that chamber? We don't know what kind of influence this ship has had on him. His voice was low, but there was a fear in it that the others could hear clearly. This whole mission is off. I'm not going any further. We should report this back and leave. The commander of the mission, a woman with short black hair and a hardened expression, narrowed her eyes. She had been through her share of space missions, dealing with strange occurrences and unexplained phenomena, but nothing could have prepared her for this. Still, she couldn't afford to be swayed by fear. She had seen far too many missions fail for lack of resolve. This one, however, was different. She knew it. There was something in her gut telling her that the answers they sought were buried deep within the wreckage of the black ship. We can't leave. Not yet, she said firmly, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. We need to know what happened here, and we need to know now. The captain might be the key to everything. As she spoke, the rest of the crew exchanged uneasy glances. A young officer, barely out of training, swallowed hard. But what if he's not who he used to be? What if he's something else now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Another engineer, older and more pragmatic, stepped forward. He had worked with deep space technology for most of his life, and while he had never encountered a situation like this, he had an instinct for survival that was hard-earned. We have to assume that whatever the captain is now, he's still the only person who knows what happened to this ship. The rest of us, we don't even know what we're dealing with. The commander nodded, but the unease in the room had not dissipated. If anything, it had grown. The black ship was not just a wreck, it was a mystery that seemed to breathe and pulse with life, as though it were watching them, waiting for them to make their next move. Whatever force was behind its disappearance, It hadn't stayed dormant for long. They slowly approached the cryogenic chamber. The captain's eyes remained closed, his body suspended in an unnatural stillness that seemed almost too perfect. If he was aware of their presence, he gave no indication. His hands were curled at his sides, and his face, though pale, bore a calm expression. But something about him felt wrong. He didn't belong in the cryochamber. No, the chamber was designed for things that were meant to stay frozen, to remain in stasis. The young officer who had spoken earlier took a hesitant step forward, his fingers trembling as he reached toward the control panel. "Are we sure we should wake him?" he asked, his voice quiet but laden with doubt. Before the commander could respond, the ship itself seemed to react. A low, vibrating hum filled the room, a pulse that seemed to echo in their bones. The lights flickered again, this time much more violently, before the control panel came to life. The screen lit up with strange symbols, patterns, that shifted and changed too quickly for anyone to read. Then, a message appeared in bold, red text. "Do not awaken the captain. He is not the one you think he is." The room went silent, the air thick with tension. No one moved. No one spoke. The words seemed to hang in the air, a chilling warning that they had all but ignored. The engineer who had been most vocal about leaving stepped back. "This is madness. We need to leave. Now." But the commander shook her head, her eyes locked onto the captain. "We can't leave without answers. This is the opportunity we've been waiting for. We've come this far." She reached for the control panel, her fingers hesitating just inches above the keys. Behind her, the rest of the crew stood still, each of them wondering if they were about to make the biggest mistake of their lives. And then, in that moment, the captain's eyes snapped open. The sudden movement was so quick and unexpected that it took everyone by surprise. The commander stumbled back, but the captain's gaze locked onto hers with an intensity that was almost otherworldly. His eyes were not those of a man who had been lost to time. They were cold, unblinking, and filled with an understanding that went beyond human comprehension. "I've waited." His voice was hoarse, but it was unmistakably him. "Waited for you. For this moment." The air in the room grew even heavier, the temperature dropping even further. The captain's lips curled into a faint smile, though it was a smile devoid of warmth. There was something alien about the way he spoke. It wasn't the captain they had been expecting. He wasn't human. Not anymore. "You shouldn't have come," he continued, his voice now almost a whisper. "You're too late." The hum of the ship grew louder, and the lights flickered wildly. It felt like the ship was alive, breathing in sync with the captain. The walls of the chamber seemed to pulsate with an unsettling rhythm. Something was stirring within the depths of the ship, something ancient and powerful. The captain's presence was no longer the only thing in the room. There was something else, something darker, more sinister. The crew exchanged terrified glances as the captain slowly rose from his cryogenic chamber. His movements were stiff, but his eyes never left the commander. "You don't understand," he said, his tone low and filled with an unsettling calm. "You never understood what you were dealing with." The air crackled with energy, the hum of the ship reaching a deafening crescendo. The young officer took another step back, his voice trembling as he spoke. What is this place? What's happening?" But the captain didn't answer. Instead, he turned slowly, his body language unnervingly mechanical, as if every step he took was guided by something other than his own will. And then, in a sudden and terrifying moment of clarity, the ship's lights went out completely. The chamber was plunged into darkness. In the silence that followed, the crew could hear nothing but their own breathing. The tension in the room had reached its peak. The only sound was the low, distant rumble of something moving through the bowels of the black ship. Something coming for them. The darkness in the room was suffocating. The lights had cut out so suddenly that it felt as though the black ship had swallowed them whole. Only the faint hum of the ship's core could be heard in the distance, and even that seemed muted, as if the ship itself was holding its breath. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though something was closing in around them. In the eerie silence, the crew could hear the faintest of movements. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed in the darkness, sending chills down their spines. No one dared to speak. Every nerve in their bodies was on edge, every sense heightened, but the overwhelming fear in the room made it impossible to focus. The captain, now free from his cryogenic chamber, was no longer just a man. He had become a presence, a force that hovered just out of reach, but always felt. The crew could feel his eyes on them, cold and unyielding. The commander's breath came in shallow gasps. She had dealt with plenty of dangerous situations in her career, but this was something else entirely. She couldn't shake the feeling that they had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. What had they woken up? What had they disturbed? And then, in the distance, a low, growling noise rumbled through the ship. It was deep, almost inhuman, and it reverberated in the very bones of the crew. It wasn't just the ship making noise. This was something else, a presence, something far more sinister. The ship's hum had morphed into a terrifying resonance, a pulse that matched the rhythm of their heartbeats, slow and measured. But whatever was moving through the bowels of the black ship wasn't walking. It was slithering. The commander took a deep breath and tried to steady her thoughts. "Everyone, stay calm. We can't panic," she whispered, though the words felt hollow in the suffocating atmosphere. "Stay together. We need to find out what's going on." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it seemed to carry, reverberating in the heavy silence. The young officer, still unnerved by the captain's strange awakening, edged closer to her, his movements stiff. What if it's already too late? What if the captain? What if he's not even human anymore? The words hung in the air for a moment, too chilling to ignore. The captain, or whatever he had become, was still standing in the center of the room, motionless. Even in the pitch blackness, they could feel him. It was as if the ship itself had wrapped him in a shroud of malevolent energy, the kind of energy that seeped into their very souls and made them question their own existence. The footsteps grew louder, more distinct. And then, from the darkness, a voice spoke, a voice that wasn't the captain's. It was distorted, alien in nature, but it was undeniably close. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered, its voice grating and hollow, like nails on metal. The sound sent shivers down their spines, and the young officer recoiled, pressing his back against the cold walls of the chamber. The commander's hand instinctively reached for her weapon, but she knew deep down that nothing they had could protect them from whatever was lurking in the depths of the ship. The air felt alive, as if it was charging with something ancient, something older than the ship itself. Suddenly, the lights flickered back to life, only to reveal the captain standing a few feet away from them, his eyes glowing in the dark. His face, though still human in shape, was distorted by something unnatural. The smooth features of a once proud leader were now twisted, cracked as if the ship itself had reshaped him, remade him into something far worse. His lips parted, revealing teeth that weren't quite human, too sharp and too white to belong to any normal being. "You think you've come to save the galaxy," the captain said, his voice now layered with a strange deep resonance, like an echo of 1,000 voices speaking at once. "But you have no idea what you've awakened, what you've become." His gaze swept over the crew, lingering on each one as if he could see into their very souls. They stood frozen, paralyzed by the weight of his words, the unrelenting pull of his presence. The walls of the room seemed to shift and warp again, a sickening crackle of energy hanging in the air. The crew's eyes darted around, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing made sense anymore. The hum of the ship grew louder, a deep, unsettling vibration that seemed to come from all around them. The temperature dropped once again, and they could see their breath clouding in the air. The black ship had become more than just a ship. It had become a living entity, an ancient, malevolent force that had been dormant for far too long. Behind them, a sound broke the silence, something heavy, dragging across the floor, its movement erratic. The young officer turned sharply, his eyes wide with fear, but it was too late. Out of the shadows, something massive emerged. A shape, a dark, writhing figure that loomed in the doorway. The crew had no time to react. The creature lunged forward with terrifying speed, its movements impossibly fluid. A blur of darkness, its tendrils stretched out, wrapping around one of the engineers, pulling him toward the cold metal walls of the ship. Screams filled the air, but they were quickly silenced. The creature had absorbed the man into the very walls of the black ship, his body vanishing without a trace. It was as though the ship had claimed him, taken him for its own, and in that instant, the crew knew the truth. They were not just fighting to survive anymore, they were fighting for their very humanity. The captain, standing in the center of the room, laughed a hollow, cruel sound that echoed through the chamber. "You're too late," he whispered again, this time his voice more intimate, like a cold breath against their necks. "The ship has already chosen. You're nothing but puppets in its game. All of you." The commander took a step back, her mind racing. She had to think fast. There had to be a way out, a way to stop this. But she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever they had just unleashed was far beyond their understanding. The ship had taken control, and they were now its playthings, caught in a web of unimaginable horrors. Suddenly, the young officer spoke up, his voice trembling but defiant. "No, we can't let it win. We can't let the ship take us. We have to fight back." But the captain, if he could still be called that, only smiled. "Fight back? You don't even know what you're fighting. You've already lost." As the last of the crew members struggled to hold their ground, the very walls of the ship seemed to close in around them. Something else, something worse was coming. A distant rumble grew louder, and from the darkness, shapes began to emerge, dozens of them, creeping along the edges of the ship. Whatever the captain had become, whatever had been awakened within the black ship, it was only the beginning. The crew had no choice now. They had to face the darkness head-on, or risk being consumed by it. And just as the captain's form flickered in and out of the shadows, they heard one final warning. "You cannot stop what is coming. The ship has already chosen you. The game is over." In the distance, the dark shapes grew larger, and the real nightmare had just begun. The crew stood at the brink of annihilation. The ship was alive, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm, as if it were feeding off their fear. The air was thick, suffocating, and the shadowy creatures that had appeared from the darkness were moving closer. The ship, whatever it had become, had transformed into a grotesque fusion of metal, flesh, and something far darker. It was no longer just a vessel, this was its true form. It was a predator, and they were its prey. The captain, or the thing that had once been the captain, stood in the center of the room, watching them with cold, calculating eyes. "You cannot escape," he said, his voice distorted and layered with an unholy echo. "This ship is no longer yours to command. It was never yours. You were always just guests, fleeting, fragile things that could never understand its true purpose." The commander gritted her teeth, her heart pounding in her chest. The young officer's face was pale, his hands shaking as he clutched his weapon, though he knew deep down that there was nothing left that could stop what was happening. The ship's power had grown beyond anything they could comprehend. But then, something unexpected happened. A spark of defiance flared within the commander's chest. She had seen horrors before, strange alien life forms, hostile environments, and impossible odds, but this was different. This was a battle for their souls. "We are not yours to control," she shouted, her voice unwavering. "We're human, and we don't give up." With a sudden movement, she grabbed a nearby terminal, her fingers flying across the screen, trying to override the ship's systems. She wasn't sure it would work. Hell, she wasn't even sure it could, but she had no other choice. The captain had once commanded this ship, but she wasn't about to let it fall under his influence. Not without a fight. Behind her, the ship seemed to react, the walls warping and shifting, as if the black ship was responding to her defiance. The captain let out a low, almost amused laugh. "You think you can stop it?" he whispered. "It's too late. The ship is me now." The room shook violently as the creatures, those writhing shadows, crawled closer. Their forms were shifting, twisting, and at first glance, it almost seemed like they were made of the very walls of the ship itself. They weren't alive in any conventional sense. They were a creation of the ship's corrupted consciousness, a manifestation of its deep, alien power. But the commander didn't falter. "We don't fight just to survive," she muttered under her breath. "We fight to win." Her hands flew across the terminal's interface, desperately trying to gain control. The hum of the ship grew louder, the walls vibrating with a strange, almost malevolent energy. The creatures were inches from them now. Time was running out. Suddenly, the ship's lights flickered, and for a brief, terrifying moment, everything went still. The captain's expression shifted. His cold smile faltered, just for a moment, but it was enough to give the commander the slightest spark of hope. She wasn't sure what had changed, but something was happening. The ship was reacting to her actions. Was she gaining control? Before she could process what was happening, the terminal buzzed with a loud warning sound. The ship's systems were fighting her. She was pushing against something ancient and powerful, something far beyond her ability to understand. But as she dug deeper into the ship's core, she realized the truth. The ship wasn't just a machine. It was a sentient being, its mind entwined with the captain's, fused with the darkness of the universe itself. "You cannot win," the captain repeated, his voice now a guttural rasp. He stepped closer, his movements now in sync with the dark creatures that surrounded them. "The ship and I are one, and you are nothing but." His words faltered as his eyes widened, the last vestiges of humanity within him screaming as the ship began to respond. Suddenly, there was a shift. The walls of the ship trembled, and the creatures screeched in pain. A burst of light erupted from the core, blinding the crew, and the ship seemed to scream in agony. The ship, once so menacing, now writhed as if it were being torn apart. It was as if the ship was rejecting the captain, rejecting whatever had happened to it. The bond that had tied the captain to the black ship was unraveling, and the creatures, those horrors that had once crawled from the depths, were being pulled back into the ship's core, disappearing into the walls. But it wasn't over yet. The commander knew something had changed, but it wasn't clear how or why. She wasn't sure if she had succeeded in gaining control, or if the ship had simply decided to fight against its own corruption. The captain, or whatever he had become, was no longer the commanding figure he once was. He was fading, his body flickering in and out of existence. The ship's bond with him was weakening, and the darkness that had once consumed him was retreating. But in his place, something worse began to emerge. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the walls of the ship trembled once again, and the captain, now nothing more than a shadow of his former self, let out a terrible scream. It wasn't a cry of rage or hatred, but something far worse. It was the sound of a mind breaking, of a consciousness being torn apart. The crew watched in horror as the captain's form collapsed into a swirling mass of shadow, his body twisting and contorting in ways that defied all logic. The creatures that had once obeyed him now turned on him, clawing and gnashing at what remained of his form. The ship, it seemed, was no longer willing to let him exist. Whatever had been left of the captain was now being consumed by the very entity that had once been his prison. But as the captain's form dissolved, the ship's hum intensified once again, as if it had awakened to a new purpose. The energy in the room shifted, growing heavier, more oppressive. Something was coming, something that the crew had no way of understanding. The commander's eyes widened as she realized what was happening. The black ship was not just rejecting the captain. It was becoming something else entirely. And whatever it was becoming was even more dangerous. Before she could react, the ship's walls buckled inward, and a single haunting voice echoed through the chamber. The game is not over. The ship has chosen. And now, it's your turn. The crew stood frozen, heartbeats quickening, trapped in the very heart of the black ship. They had thought they had won. They had thought they understood the game. But the truth was far more terrifying. The black ship wasn't just an enemy. It was a force, a creature, a living nightmare that would not be stopped. Not now. Not ever. And just like that, the room plunged into darkness once again. The crew stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. What was this creature? What did it want? Was it truly a being of consciousness, or was it simply a corrupted remnant of the ship's long-forgotten creators? The commander swallowed hard, her thoughts racing. "We didn't come here to help you evolve," she said, her voice steady, but her heart racing. "We came here to stop the madness, to stop this ship from destroying everything in its path." The creature laughed, the sound echoing through the chamber, sending a chill down their spines. "You think you can stop it? I was born to endure. I have outlived civilizations. I have seen empires rise and fall. And I will see the end of your kind, should I choose to." For a moment, the room was filled with an oppressive silence. The crew knew that they were standing at the edge of something far beyond them, something they didn't fully understand. They had come to this ship in hopes of rescuing the captain, but now they realized it was never about him. It had never been about him. The entity in front of them began to shift again, its form stretching and twisting into something even more incomprehensible. It was as if it were testing the limits of its own being, pushing against the very fabric of reality itself. The crew could feel the air growing heavier, the energy building up around them. "We cannot allow this," the commander said firmly, stepping forward. "There must be a way to stop you." The creature's form flickered, as if amused. "You think you can stop me? You have no idea what I am capable of. But if you wish to try, then I shall give you one chance." With a sudden movement, the ship's core pulsed with an intense light. The energy flooded the room, overwhelming their senses. The walls seemed to bend and twist around them, the very ship distorting itself in response to the power surging through it. In that moment, the commander realized what she had to do. She reached into the terminal on the side of the room, fingers flying across the keys, her mind racing. The ship's energy was more than just a weapon. It was a source of power, but it could be harnessed, repurposed. If she could reroute it, if she could connect it to the ship's ancient systems, perhaps she could overload it, severing the connection between the consciousness and the ship itself. With a deep breath, she executed the final command. The ship's core exploded with a brilliant flash of light, blinding them all. For a moment, everything went still. And then, there was nothing. When the light finally faded, the room was silent. The walls, once pulsing with life, were now still. The hum of the ship's core was gone, replaced by an eerie calm. The ship had stopped. Its presence had vanished. The crew looked around in disbelief. The ship, the creature, the endless horror, it was all gone. There was no more power, no more life. The black ship had ceased to exist in the way they had known it. They had won. Or had they? The commander took a cautious step forward, her eyes scanning the now lifeless surroundings. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew that their journey wasn't over. The black ship might have been defeated, but the forces that had created it, the darkness that had shaped it, still lingered in the far corners of the galaxy. But for now, they had survived. And that was enough. As the crew gathered together, the remnants of their mission now behind them, they turned their gaze toward the stars beyond, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it as a team. The ship was gone, but the story wasn't over. The galaxy was vast, and they had only just begun to understand the depths of what was out there. And that was a truth they would carry with them, always. The black ship was gone. But its legacy, its warning would remain. The crew stood frozen, heartbeats quickening, trapped in the very heart of the black ship. They had thought they had won. They had thought they understood the game. But the truth was far more terrifying. The black ship wasn't just an enemy. It was a force, a creature, a living nightmare that would not be stopped. Not now. Not ever. As the darkness swallowed them whole, they realized the nightmare had only just begun. The silence that followed was deafening. The crew, still frozen in the pitch-black room, could barely hear their own breath over the unsettling hum of the ship. It had been only moments since the darkness swallowed them, yet it felt like an eternity. The ship, once a powerful cold machine of destruction, had become something much worse. Something alive, twisted, and far beyond their understanding. The commander's mind raced, her thoughts tangled in a mess of panic, disbelief, and a fierce resolve to survive. The last words of the captain, "No." The thing that had been the captain echoed in her mind. The game is not over. The ship has chosen, and now it's your turn. Her eyes strained to adjust to the blackness, but there was no light to guide her. Only the ship's low, resonating hum, growing louder by the second. It wasn't just noise. It felt like a pulse, a rhythm alive in a way that had no precedent, no explanation. It was the heartbeat of something ancient, something incomprehensible. She wasn't sure how long they stood there, waiting for the next move, for anything that would explain the terrifying power the ship had gained. She had seen the way the walls trembled, the way the creatures had been pulled back into the ship. The creatures that had once been his minions were now gone, but the ship's power was undiminished. She could feel it in the air. The tension was unbearable, thick as the darkest night. And then a voice broke through the silence. This time, it wasn't the distorted echo of the captain. It was something else entirely. Deep, otherworldly, but somehow still familiar. "You have awakened me, but I do not hunger for your destruction. I hunger for freedom." The voice was everywhere, vibrating through the walls, pulsing in their bones. The crew, though frightened, couldn't help but listen. It wasn't hostile, at least, not yet. It spoke of freedom, but freedom from what? What had they awakened? And more importantly, what had they released? The ship was no longer just a vessel. It was a living entity, a consciousness that had been trapped, bound by an ancient force. The captain had only been its first prisoner, a vessel for the ship's hunger. But now, the ship was free, or at least, it was beginning to break free. The boundaries between man and machine, life and death, were collapsing. It wasn't just a ship anymore. It was a being with desires, with needs. The commander felt a strange shift, a subtle understanding breaking through the fear and confusion. The ship wasn't looking to destroy them. It had been dormant for centuries, locked in a cage of its own making, manipulated by forces far older than any of them. The captain, what had once been the captain, was merely a part of its past, an unfortunate pawn in a much larger game. The crew's movements became more deliberate, more focused. Whatever this ship was, they had to figure it out before it decided to act on its desires. There was no escaping it. There was only survival, and perhaps a way to end the cycle it had trapped itself in. "We need to find the core," the commander finally whispered, her voice carrying more certainty than fear. She knew now that the heart of this ship held the answers, the key to stopping whatever it had become. The crew, now determined, moved cautiously through the corridors, the walls still pulsing with energy. They reached the heart of the ship, the core. It was a vast chamber, larger than any of them could have imagined, filled with intricate machinery that hummed with unnatural power. But at its center was a mass of tendrils, writhing and coiling, almost organic in appearance. It was here that the ship's consciousness was most concentrated. And there, standing in the middle of the chamber, was something they could never have anticipated. A figure, not human, not machine and entity. It radiated power, its form shifting like liquid metal, constantly changing. It wasn't just the ship anymore. It was the ship's consciousness, its spirit, free from the constraints it had once known. "You understand now," it said, the voice both alien and familiar. "I was born to this. But I do not wish to remain in this form. I seek to evolve."